Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by CEI. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We'll be chatting with a pair of interesting characters this week, leading off with Stephen Moore, who recently left the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal to become chief economist at the Conservative Heritage Foundation. In the second half of the hour, we'll be talking to Jonathan Rauch, a free speech and gay rights activist with the left-leaning Brookings Institution. Both are here because they share a common respect for the market liberal principles that allow us to engage in healthy and cordial debate, even when we agree to disagree. If you're a fan of Stephen Moore's op-eds, you may have been disappointed to learn he was leaving the Wall Street Journal to head back to Heritage, where he served as a fellow early in his career. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Many people view the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal as the pinnacle of the profession. What made you decide to step down and return to the think tank world?
Well, I've always loved Heritage. This is where I got my start, and as the chief economist at the Heritage Foundation, the biggest and one of the most influential think tanks in the country, I can really have a huge impact on policy decisions in the states and at the federal level and around the world.
Do you really think ideas still have the power to influence public policy, or have we become so irredeemably tribal in our politics that all that matters is tactics?
Well, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't think that ideas matter. I think it's pretty clear that they do, and I think that our goal as free market advocates is not only to make the intellectual case that free markets are superior to government intervention, but also to make the case in an understandable and friendly way to voters so that we can win in these policy battles that are so critical, whether it's about the future of Obamacare or how to deal with this enormous national debt or how to create jobs.
Well, focus in on that last bit, that understandable and friendly way. What do you mean by that?
Well, we have to be able to communicate this message of the free enterprise system in a way that average Americans can understand it and will embrace it. And oftentimes we come across as kind of having a winner-take-all attitude, and that's not how the free enterprise system works at all. I mean, I always make the case that the greatest cure for poverty in the history of the world is capitalism.
And yet people fight it tooth and nail and continue to promote socialism, even though everywhere it's tried, it's failed.
That's so true, and that's what's so frustrating about, trying to get this message across to people is how do we explain the reason that the United States is the richest country in the world and the most prosperous place in this great land of opportunity is precisely because we, for the most part, have a free market system that allows people to exploit their talents and to be what they want to be. And that's really almost unique to the United States. Despite all our flaws, the United States is still the freest country in the world.
I think we've fallen out of the top 10. I hate to correct you, but when I look at the latest ratings, we're not even in the top 10 of the freest countries in the world.
Well, I just mean in terms of opportunity. Why is it that someone can come here as an immigrant with only the shirt on their back and soon become the president of a major technology company? That doesn't happen anywhere else but in the United States.
And yet that doesn't seem to convince people that freedom matters. They seem to be more convinced by free stuff.
Well, that's the real danger, isn't it? That people become so hooked on government that we can't give it up and that we become dependent. And this is the big challenge that we have as people who believe in free enterprise.
Do you worry that democracy may have passed the tipping point now that the majority of voters are getting a check from the government?
I mean, it's always a worry, but A, I don't think we're there yet. And B, I believe that we have kind of respect for freedom that is almost in our DNA as Americans. So I think in the end, the United States voters will not choose socialism. They will choose freedom. And I really believe that this is kind of our destiny as a nation.
But it's never presented that way. No one sells socialism as socialism in the United States. They sell it as solving problems, and they always focus on the motives behind the programs, never on the results. And each of those programs, when they fail, they go back and say, we didn't work hard enough on it. We didn't put enough budget into it. How do you fight against that?
Well, we have to be able to explain to the American people where wealth comes from and the fact that the reason we have jobs and we have incomes and that we have TVs and we have food on our table is because of production of people. So I think that most Americans get that instinctively. And look, most Americans don't want to go on welfare. They do want to have a job. They do want to create a better future for their children. And this is our goal as policy advocates, to persuade the American people that when Barack Obama is offering up all these free things, that there's nothing really very free about it.
Well, they're taking it from the wealthy 1%. The greedy 1% is where the source of all this comes from, is it not?
Well, they try to, but you really want to redistribute income. I mean, we're still a nation where most of the income in this country is with the middle class. So they're going to have to come after the middle class. And really all they're doing is robbing from one Peter to pay to another Paul. And so it's just a game of shuffling around income rather than creating wealth in the first place. That's what my book, Who's the Fairest of Them All, is really about, that when any government tries to put fairness over growth, you get neither fairness nor growth.
Well, that's been proven, I think, in spades in France, and it seems
right. And unfortunately, it may soon be proven in New York City, where they've just elected essentially a Sandinista mayor who all he talks about is redistributing wealth, not creating it, and that's such a sad situation.
Well, it'll be an interesting test case to see if New York returns to the condition it was when I was a kid back in the 60s and 70s.
It's really scary that so many people can't remember or weren't old enough to remember how bad things could get before you had these reforms.
Oh, the graffitis chewing subways and the squeegee people, and cops would only go out in groups of 4 at night in Times Square because they were afraid.
Yep, and that reduction in crime and the reduction in poverty and the cleanup of the city, those were conscious policy decisions. And I really am very fearful that people have kind of forgotten about how bad things
But all they
get.
see is the excesses of the rich, which is made worse, of course, by the crony capitalists and the folks on Wall Street who are in league with Washington. There's an enormous amount of boiling resentment. How do you deal with that?
Oh my gosh, it's such a tough thing. I think, you have to appeal to Americans' sense of real fairness. That is it fair to take from someone who works hard and give it to someone who's not working? I always tell the story that, I have 2 sons, both of them are teenagers. One worked all summer and the other, basically sat on his butt and watched TV. And the left's idea of fairness is to tax the one who worked and give it to the one who didn't work. And I said that at least in the Moore family, that's not going to lead to more work. It's going to lead to less of it. But
what about taking from the bailout banker?
The who?
Let's not claim that all that money was earned. What about taking it for the banker that was on the receiving end of bailouts?
Well, I was never in favor of bailouts in the first place, and this is why, we probably shouldn't have given away taxpayer money to people who made bad decisions. I mean, all you do when you bail out one company is you take money from the good actors and you give it to the bad actors. And one of the mistakes we made in 2008 and 2009 was that we essentially took money away from businesses that did the right thing and gave it to the bad actors, the people who took gigantic risks or became too over-leveraged. And the long-term implication of that, by the way, is not only does it disrupt Americans' feeling that we really are a free enterprise system, but it also leads to a situation where you do get this kind of too big to fail doctrine that's become almost enshrined in our laws, so that everyone expects that big banks and big insurance companies and big brokerages are going to get bailed out the next time they get in trouble. And that only encourages the bad behavior that started the cycle.
Well, this is the moral hazard cycle.
The moral hazard, exactly.
Do you think it's important to denounce crony capitalists, or does that just confuse people because they hear the word capitalist and they lump it all in together?
No, of course. I mean, the left is the one who believes in crony capitalism. I mean, just listen to Barack Obama's State of the Union when he talked about more subsidies for solar companies and wind companies and these kinds of companies. And that.
More subsidies for the chosen winners, right?
Right, exactly. The government dictates who should be in business and should get taxpayer money. Of course, we've got such a great example the last few years that doesn't work very well. We've spent $100 billion on wind and solar and other kinds of green energy subsidies, and it was just money down a rat hole.
But what about the argument that you're supporting infant industries and over time they'll become important? Isn't that what economists say?
Well, I love the argument that windmills are an infant industry since we've had windmills since the medieval times. Somebody's got to explain to me how the wind industry is an infant industry.
That's good. You're an economist by training, and does it distress you when 2 economists with diametrically opposing theories of how the economy works share the Nobel Prize in the same year? I mean, this doesn't happen in physics.
Well, there have been a lot of really bad economists who've won the Nobel Prize. I mean, my goodness, Paul Krugman, who's been the wrongest economist in the last 20 years, has a Nobel Prize. But on the other hand, F.A. Hayek and Milton Friedman have Nobel Prizes as well. In
terms of understanding how the economy works, do you worry about the numbers that are coming out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Bureau of Economic Analysis? They're telling us that unemployment is down to 6.7%. They're telling us that inflation is down under 2%. Do you believe those numbers?
The inflation rate is very low, and so I certainly do believe that. I mean, I'm surprised by it because I've been predicting higher inflation with all this money creation, but there hasn't been a lot of velocity of that money, which explains why we've had record amounts of money printed, but very low rates
Sitting
of
in
inflation.
vaults.
On the other hand, the employment numbers, I don't think that they're kind of intentionally twisting the numbers, but I don't think they're really measuring the right thing. They're not measuring people who've dropped out of the labor force. They're not measuring people who can only find a job for 26 or 28 hours a week. They're not measuring people who are maybe in their late 50s, early 60s who've just decided they're not going to work anymore. So when you've got 90 million people of working age in this country that aren't working, that's a big problem. I think the real unemployment rate in this country is probably closer to 10%.
But here you are trying to use facts and reason to fight against a very well-crafted and expertly promoted narrative. The narrative that's being promoted is that unemployment's going down. The government says so. The newspapers pick it up. They say so. The analysts say so. And here you are with facts and reason, and you don't stand a chance. Well,
I don't know about that. I mean, if you look at the recent polls, and not just by conservatives, but, the Gallup poll, they find that, 65 to 70% of Americans don't think that the recession ever ended. So you can't lie to the American people about the statistics. They know what's happening in the real economy. They know how hard it is to find a job. And, this is reflected in the attitude of the public that there's something very terribly wrong with the direction our economy is going in.
Most Americans are blissfully unaware of the fact that the U.S. Constitution once constrained the federal government to a pretty short list of strictly enumerated powers.
Yep.
Do you think there's any hope of limited government making a comeback, or is the future all about which tribe is in control in Washington?
I do think there can be a return to constitutional government. Americans do have a respect for the rights that are given to them in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And look at how the left's chances to try to impose things like gun control. There's been a revolt by the citizenry almost all over the country against those kinds of initiatives.
Do you think that federalism will stage a comeback? We're starting to see states go their own way. Colorado just ended the drug war, at least when it comes to marijuana. We're seeing a real bifurcation between red states and blue states and how they're handling a lot of policies. As Washington sinks into gridlock, you think we'll see the states come to the fore?
Yeah, I do. I think, and we're seeing that now. I'm writing a book with Arthur Laffer about the new economic war between the states, and what you're seeing is red states that are adopting kind of the Reaganomics model are completely outcompeting the blue states that are adopting the Obamonomics model. And so you're seeing a migration of capital and people and businesses.
And they're voting with their feet.
They're voting with their feet at record numbers, by the way. The problem is President Obama wants to nationalize everything, as he did with health care and energy policy and the environment and so on, which reduces the ability for states to compete, and that's exactly the wrong way to go.
What do you think is going to happen in California? They've been the bellwether for so many things. Where do you see California heading?
California's still got massive problems. Things are getting better in California, but they still have massive problems. They have the highest tax rates virtually in the country. They have the highest unfunded debts. They have adopted cap-and-trade laws. So these things are really holding back the California economy. It's interesting, and California's making a comeback now, but I think it's not a durable comeback because California, despite its beautiful weather and its great universities and beautiful beaches and mountains, it has natural advantages, but those advantages only take you so far when you impose such enormous millstones around the neck of the businesses and the workers.
And convince the productive ones to maybe head elsewhere. When you hit bottom, let's look at Detroit for a minute. When the old model hits bottom, do you think there might be a chance to come back and start enterprise zones or really do radical surgery on a city like Detroit and turn it around, or do you think it's going to remain a basket case?
Actually, I'm kind of optimistic about Detroit. I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal about how Michigan's making a big comeback outside of Detroit that people haven't been paying attention to. But there's a mini renaissance going on in manufacturing in this country in states like Ohio and Michigan, which is a wonderful thing to see. Detroit, I actually think the best thing that ever happened to Detroit in the last 20 years was the declaration of bankruptcy, which allows them to sweep away all of the bad ideas and really to start over again. And so, I'm actually somewhat bullish about Detroit because they're, of course, they're starting at such a low point. Mm-hmm. There's only one way for them to go, but I do think Detroit could make a really strong comeback. They've elected a good city manager, a good mayor that want to move away from the failed socialist policies of the past with high taxes and high regulations. And keep your eye on Detroit. In 10 years, they could be back big time.
Steve, looking at the political scene right now, do you think the Republicans can regain the devotion to small government, or will the old bulls prevail and just try to regain power and go back to business as usual?
My line to the Republicans is, look, you have to fight for the principles that you believe in, or the voters, including the Tea Party voters, which caused the massive 2010 election for Republicans, they're just not going to turn out.
One of the challenges is picking the right fights, though. If they go after gay marriage, they're going to just shoot themselves in the foot. How do you stop that from happening?
Gay marriage, that's not an issue I really work on, but I do think that the country is mostly focused on the economy and jobs. I mean, the opinion polls show very clearly that's issue 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for voters is how do we get more jobs? How do we have our incomes up? And that's what Republicans have to do. And they have to translate their policy proposals on the budget, on taxes, on litigation reform, on health care, not just how they're going to solve those problems, but how they're going to impact the average American in terms of freeing up more jobs, increasing incomes. I mean, the average family income in the last 4 years during this, quote, recovery is down by $2,000. That's a huge, huge hit that American families are taking at a time when they're supposed to be in a recovery.
So how do you get them to focus on economic issues and not get lured into culture war battles? Time and time again, they get lured in, and that's what the headlines read.
Well, look, I think Republicans have to also be for the kind of social values that help build our country. We know from evidence that Heritage and other institutes have put out that one of the leading causes of inequality and people stuck in the bottom rungs of the economic ladder is because they come from broken families, right? That there's no family in the home. And, your likelihood of being in poverty is 4 times higher if you don't have a father in the home than if you do. I think for them to win, they should be adopting this kind of line that a stable family,
is good because it works.
It's good because it works, and there's reasons for over thousands of years that these social institutions have developed because they do work. I mean, one of the other big challenges we face is that we have seen such a massive increase in the number of people on food stamps, unemployment insurance, disability.
And what happened? Clinton fixed that. What happened? Clinton administration was an amazing achievement, and I was not a fan of his, an amazing achievement to fix welfare and reduce dependency. And what happened to that all?
Well, the left came back with this crazy idea that government creates jobs and that government welfare programs and government spending on infrastructure and things like that are job creators. And so you've even got people in the Obama administration to this day who say, extend unemployment insurance because it's a stimulus for the economy. The idea that you're going to pay someone not to work and therefore you're going to get more work, that's a crazy, lunatic idea. But it's amazing how many people believe that. Just read the New York Times editorial page.
But they have sustained that narrative through thick and thin, and it's very difficult for people who believe in markets to puncture that narrative with facts as opposed to a counter-narrative.
True. That's true.
Steve, unfortunately, we're out of time. I really appreciate you being on the show. Good luck in your new position.
Thank you. Anytime. Take care.
This is Real Clear Radio Hour. I'm your host, Bill Frezza, and we've been talking to Steve Moore, recently named Chief Economist at the Heritage Foundation. When we come back, we're going to talk to Jonathan Rauch, a free speech and gay rights activist with a Brookings institution. Stay tuned.